Before I go back to the monasteries and things, I did just want to ask you a little bit, because you're part of the Free Church of England, right? That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that is different to the actual formal Anglican Church.
No.
Right.
No.
Please explain.
So it's separate from the Church of England, but it's not separate from the. So it is part of the Anglican Church.
Right. Sorry.
We're in communion with 80% of Anglicans around the world. So we're in the majority actually.
Right. Okay, that puts it in a whole different perspective.
Yeah, but it's just in this country the common Anglican denomination is the Church of England, and of course it will be, because it's established church. It's establishment church. It's part of the state infrastructure, and that has good things and bad things to it. But in 1844, the Free Church of England split from the C of E, actually as a counter movement to the Oxford movement, which is interesting because I'm very Tractarian, so I come from the other end and things have changed over those years. But it split in 1844, and now it's part of the GAFCON movement, which is the Global Anglican Future Conference movement, which is the global movement of Anglicans around the world that are Orthodox and see that the church in England, America, Canada, and Australia is going essentially woke and liberal progressive and moving away from doctrine and from tradition and from reason.
Right. Okay. So important.
Yeah.
It's important, I think, important work.
But, what's important about it, in my opinion, is that people can remain Anglican and they can remain Orthodox, but they don't have to stay within the Church of England. And if people feel like the Church of England has moved away from them or left them behind, there's still a home for them in this country. And that's within the GAFCON movement. And there are multiple jurisdictions. The Free Church of England is just one of those jurisdictions, but there are more evangelical jurisdictions too in the Anglican network in Europe that people can join. They just don't necessarily know about them because they're relatively small compared to where they are. In North America, GAFCON's huge. The ACNA, Anglican Church of North America, I wouldn't be surprised if that overtook the Episcopal Church at some point in the future. Yeah. Huh. And it's, of course, massive in Africa too, where there are still many, many Orthodox Anglicans.
It's very interesting. So if you were always an Anglican or even a member of the Church of England, and then the Archbishop of Canterbury comes out with something that you not only think is wrong-headed, but you think is evil or something, there's still...
Which is happening right now with living in love and faith, in that he's pushing for homosexual marriage and the option to rebaptize people if they supposedly change gender, which we know is not a thing you can do according to the Bible. So... Right. Yeah, they are heading into apostasy. So if people want to avoid apostasy and heresy and blasphemy, so they can come and join us.
There's a home for you, if that applies to you.
But why it's interesting in why it's relevant to our conversation is because when they split, the Free Church of England, otherwise known as the Reformed Episcopal Church, was because they thought that the Church of England was becoming too Roman or too papist.
And sorry, is this sort of the mid-19th century?
Yeah.
Right, okay, sorry.
And of course, we had the Oxford movement taking off at that point. And the Oxford movement is essentially saying this church has always been a Catholic church, the Church of England. We've always been the Church of England, but it's always been Catholic. And the Reformation was about fixing errors and getting rid of superstition, but it didn't mean we don't have to be Catholic anymore. And it was about, this is what the high church tradition is. It's about smells and bells and things that help people in their faith. Again, beauty and embracing all of the senses, but also going back to our tradition and reclaiming our tradition and the parts of it that we lost through the Reformation, the parts of it that were important, that the reactionary Protestants overcorrected.
Right. Like the Puritans, sort of your classic idea of a Puritan that completely rejects any sort of baubles, any sort of golden incense. And it's going back against that and saying, actually, a church should be magnificent. A church should inspire awe. It should take you to another place. It should provide beauty, because there are a lot of people who are suffering, a lot of normal, ordinary folk that can't afford golden mantle places. And it's nice for them to go into a church that has golden reredos and altars, and it takes them to the transcendental place. It takes them to somewhere else, and it helps them in their prayer. That is a good thing. Whereas the Puritans would say, oh, no, it's too much, it's too indulgent, and we need to get rid of all of that. It needs to just be bare and bland, and I can see an argument for it, but at the same time, I think that doesn't help, or it doesn't help me. Right, and that's what the Oxford movement was. It was like, we need to reconnect. Yeah, I immediately think of some of the grand abbeys and cathedrals where you go inside and you even me as a non-Christian, you cannot help but be overawed by the space that you're in. There's no way you can't.
No.
And the idea of sort of a Puritan preaching hall, whitewashed, completely blank pews, the altar is just a wooden table.
Yeah. But that's it. So it wasn't just, these things aren't just aesthetic, they're theological too. So they make a difference. Having a wooden table for the Lord's table is saying this is not an altar. That's what they're saying. But having an altar is important because as Christians during Holy Communion, we are entering the everlasting sacrifice of Christ. We are partaking and observing in his sacrifice, and we're offering ourselves to be a living sacrifice of praise and worship as well. But it's not a new sacrifice. He's already been sacrificed himself for us, but we're acknowledging that, and that's what an altar does. But the Puritans would say, well, no, an altar is to, a sacrificial priesthood is to Old Testament, and Christ came to get rid of that. So it's the Oxford movement is re-engaging that conversation and saying, well, no, we need an altar because of this, and therefore if we need an altar, we also need to be teaching about Christ's sacrifice more. And there comes into it the difference in that the Protestants are heavily reliant on the Word of God, which is so vitally important, but not the sacraments. And Christ initiated the sacraments. He taught us to drink this in remembrance of me, and eat my body. And these are things that we should celebrate and do as often as possible, because they are when we're closest to him, because then we are with him in body and blood. So I think that's why the Anglican Church is so important and so good, because the Roman Catholics focus a lot on the sacraments, which are a good thing, and the Protestants focus a lot on the Word of God, which is a good thing, and we try to bring them together.
Like the Eucharist you mentioned there, that sort of thing. There's a great film, Oliver, about Oliver Cromwell with Richard Harris. I don't know if you've ever seen that. No. It's from the early 70s. And I think there's a few bits in that where as a child I first framing my thinking over the ideas of the Puritans and things, where they would equate anything nice, gold candlesticks, or any stained glass whatsoever, with sort of the stink of popery, sort of the inherent evil wrong-headedness of Rome. And of course, I think it's fair that is just a reaction. That's a reaction, isn't it? And I just find it interesting that Christianity, in all sorts of ways, not even in the 19th century, up to today, there's still sort of fundamental breaks over that sort of thing. Massive. You know, like the Eastern Orthodox Church is practiced very, very differently, isn't it, to a Scottish church, for example. I mean, it's night and day almost. Yeah,
but we should love our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, and just because they erred doesn't mean that everything they did is wrong. And that's why I don't like that Protestant reactionary response, because like, oh, that's too Catholic. But okay, but is it good? Is it scriptural? Is it true? That's what's important, not is it Catholic, because being that word just means universal. The Catholic faith is a universal faith, and we still have a lot of that reactionary response to Catholics today, and it's kind of ingrained in our culture a bit.
Do you think, just before we do actually go back to the monasteries again, do you think that's not unique to England by any stretch, but there's a particularly English strain of being suspicious of Catholicism, that we've got our own unique version of that?
Yeah, no, for good reason. You know, like I said, I do feel the Reformation was the first Brexit, and we should never be ruled by a foreign land or a foreign leader in a foreign land. Of course, we should reject that quite strongly, but that doesn't mean we reject everything that person was doing. And the Bishop of Rome was trying to lead the Christian faith, and the Christian faith is important, and we can't separate them. So yeah, it's difficult.
Of course, by the Bishop of Rome, you mean the Pope. Yeah. Just to be clear for us.
Well, he wasn't always known as a Pope, and that's not even his official title. He is the Bishop of Rome, isn't he?
Right, yeah. Or the successor to St. Peter. They've got a few different names they like to use, don't they?
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.